By the summer of 1940, continental Europe had effectively collapsed. Poland had been crushed in weeks, Denmark and Norway fell quickly. The German offensive through Belgium and the Netherlands outflanked French defenses that had been considered nearly impenetrable. In just 6 weeks, France, one of the major military powers of the world, surrendered. When the forces of Adolf Hitler entered Paris, it was not simply a symbolic victory. It represented the near-total domination of Western and Central Europe. German industry now had access to French factories, Czech armaments, Belgian resources, and the labor of occupied territories. The Reich was no longer a continental power. It was the dominant power in Europe. Great Britain stood alone. Winston Churchill delivered speeches promising resistance whatever the cost may be, but Britain's strategic position was precarious. The country relied heavily on maritime imports for food, oil, and raw materials. German U-boats began systematically targeting Atlantic convoys. In 1940 and 1941, shipping losses were severe. Every cargo vessel sunk meant less grain, less fuel, fewer industrial components. Even if Germany never successfully invaded the British Isles, economic strangulation could have forced negotiations. At this stage, the United States remained officially neutral. Isolationist sentiment was still strong among the American public. However, President Franklin D. Roosevelt increasingly understood that a German-dominated Europe would fundamentally alter global power structures. If Britain fell, the Atlantic would no longer be a buffer. The destroyer's 4 bases agreement in 1940 signaled the beginning of active support. Then came the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941. This policy allowed the United States to supply nations whose defense was deemed vital to American security. In practical terms, it meant weapons, ammunition, aircraft, vehicles, food, oil, and raw materials flowed across the Atlantic. By late 1941, Britain's survival was no longer purely a matter of domestic endurance. It depended heavily on American production. The war was already becoming industrial, and America possessed unmatched industrial depth. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. Entire Soviet armies were encircled. Hundreds of thousands were captured in the opening months. The Wehrmacht advanced deep into Soviet territory, approaching Moscow by winter. It seemed possible that the Soviet Union might collapse under the scale of the assault. The Eastern Front quickly became the central theater of the war. The majority of German divisions were deployed there, and the scale of combat dwarfed anything in Western Europe. The Soviet Union would ultimately suffer tens of millions of casualties, both military and civilian. Yet modern total war depended on more than manpower. The Soviet Union relocated large parts of its industrial base beyond the Ural Mountains. This evacuation was extraordinary, but production gaps remained. Transportation networks were strained, fuel supplies were inconsistent. Communication equipment was limited. American Lend-Lease shipments began arriving in significant quantities. The United States supplied roughly 400,000 trucks and jeeps to the Soviet Union. These vehicles gave mobility to Soviet forces during major offensives after 1943. Without mechanized transport, large-scale encirclements and rapid breakthroughs would have been far more difficult. Thousands of locomotives and rail cars supported Soviet logistics. Millions of tons of food stabilized military rations during critical years. Aluminum, copper, machine tools, and explosives filled industrial shortages. Marshal Georgy Zhukov later acknowledged that American vehicles significantly enhanced operational mobility. Soviet leadership publicly emphasized self-reliance but privately recognized the material importance of Allied support. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and Germany's declaration of war on the United States in December 1941, American industrial mobilization accelerated dramatically. Civilian factories converted to military production. Automobile plants began producing tanks and aircraft. Shipyards expanded at unprecedented speed. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly half of the world's industrial output. American factories built tens of thousands of aircraft annually. Shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than German submarines could sink them. Oil production ensured stable fuel supplies not only for American forces but also for allies. Germany, despite its technological sophistication, lacked access to comparable raw materials and industrial scale. Strategic bombing campaigns further reduced German production capacity. Over time, the Axis powers faced a widening material gap they could not close. The Soviet Union bore the overwhelming human cost on the Eastern Front. However, American industrial capacity created a structural imbalance in resources that gradually eroded Germany's ability to sustain prolonged warfare. By 1943, Germany was fighting a two-front war in practice, but not yet in full force. Western Europe remained under German control. The longer a second front was delayed, the longer the Soviet Union would absorb the primary burden. The opening of a Western front required enormous logistical preparation. Millions of tons of supplies had to be transported across the Atlantic. Air superiority had to be secured. Naval dominance was essential. On June 6, 1944, Normandy landings marked the largest amphibious invasion in history. American, British, and Canadian forces landed along the French coast. American troops formed a major component of the assault forces, particularly at Omaha and Utah beaches. The scale of logistics behind the operation was staggering: thousands of ships, tens of thousands of vehicles, and massive air support. Such an undertaking required industrial output on a scale only the United States could sustain at that moment. Once the Normandy beachhead was secured, Allied forces advanced across France. Germany now faced coordinated offensives from east and west. Simultaneously, Allied strategic bombing continued, targeting German oil facilities, transportation networks, and industrial centers. In December 1944, Germany launched its final major counteroffensive in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge involved hundreds of thousands of American soldiers. Though costly, the offensive failed. After that, German strategic initiative effectively ended. By early 1945, Allied forces crossed into Germany from the west while Soviet forces advanced from the east. The convergence of these fronts made continued German resistance unsustainable. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, millions of American troops were deployed in Europe. The outcome was the product of combined Allied effort. The Soviet Union endured the heaviest casualties. Britain maintained resistance during the darkest period. But American economic power, industrial production, naval control of the Atlantic, and the opening of the Western Front fundamentally altered the strategic balance. In industrialized total war, numbers of soldiers alone are insufficient. Sustained production, transportation networks, fuel supplies, and global logistics determine long-term viability. In those domains, the United States possessed advantages that no other belligerent could match. The European war was not won by one nation alone. It was won through a combination of Soviet manpower and sacrifice, British endurance, and American industrial and military capacity. Remove any one of those elements, and the timeline, or even the outcome, might have been very different.